In 2018, Black Panther was released to global acclaim and would start a rush that swept through Hollywood and the rest of the world. It grossed over $1.3 billion worldwide, making it one of the highest grossing movies ever. It broke several box office records and became the first MCU movie to win an Oscar. Beyond the box office, the Wakanda Forever cry made its biggest impact on African audiences. From Lagos to Nairobi, fans turned up at screenings in Afrofuturistic clothes. On social media, Africans posted selfies dressed in Black Panther or superhero-inspired costumes. Athletes celebrated their victories with the Wakanda Forever salute. Finally, the world could see us. Even better than the red carpets and cosplays were the conversations the movie stirred up. People began to ask, are there any true African comics in Africa? Does Nigeria have its own comics? Who was Nigeria's first superhero? It has been almost a decade since T'Challa stole our hearts, and the comic scene is now livelier than it used to be. But where there is new, there is old. If we do not know the forgotten heroes of Nigerian comics, how then do we appreciate the new? In this video, we time travel to the past to dig up the comics, old and forgotten. In 1975, Pekin Press, later called Pekin Publication, saw that there were no African comics created for local audiences and decided to fill that gap in the market. Since most comics sold in the Nigerian markets were reprints of British comics which featured almost only white characters, Pekin Press sought to develop a comic with black superheroes, which the average Nigerian could relate to. Another goal for creating the comic was to promote literacy. For this, they commissioned Dave Gibbons and Brian Bollard to develop a Nigerian comic superhero. The publishers believed there were no African comic book artists and would only emerge after comics became popular in Africa. The writers for the comic were Don Avenel and Norman Walker, while Gibbons and Bollard illustrated. Gibbons and Bollard will admit in interviews that they struggled to create the comic for a Nigerian audience. Pekin Press instructed them to do simple storytelling, as their comic was meant for illiterates. They even had to include numbers in the panel so people would know in which order to read them. The imagery also had to be adapted to fit the culture. For example, a fat stomach meant the man was successful and powerful rather than greedy. Another inclusion was that having Powerman get the girls in the end was not considered sexist in Nigeria. Powerman wore a pink bodysuit with leopard knickers and fought all kinds of threats, from dinosaurs to robots, which were new ideas in the Nigerian cartoon space. His origin story was that he was struck by lightning as a child, which gave him superhuman strength, intelligence, durability, and the ability to fly. His only weakness was snake bites, which his creators assumed was a common occurrence in Nigeria and would make their character more relatable. The Powerman comics were later reprinted in South Africa and was accused of being used to support the apartheid regime. South Africa's segregated society of the 70s and 80s meant that there were rebranded Marvel and DC comics like Supermax and Flash for Black Africans, and separate titles for whites. Comics created by whites for Black Africans were often full of biases, such as the oversimplification of the Powerman comics, which showed how lowly Pekin Press viewed their audience. These types of superheroes we are moved to call Afro superheroes, as they were biased portrayals of Africans. Basically, characters whose only relation to the African audience they were created for was that they were also light-skinned and had an origin story set in Africa. Comics that was created by non-Africans faced hostility from the same black audience they were trying to appeal to. This was the basis for the accusations against Powerman Comics. Although the South African publication was done without the permission of Peking Press, Gibbons was unhappy with his comic being accused of being used to discriminate against blacks in South Africa, and it probably led to the end of the series in 1977. Mighty Man, the human law enforcing dynamo, became the first illustrated South African superhero comics for black Africans. It began in 1975, the same year Powerman debuted in Nigeria and had a press run of 75,000 copies. According to the comic law, Mighty Man was Danny Ndolomu. He was a police officer who was first to retire after being shot by thieves during a robbery. His injuries were eventually healed by a strange race of underground creatures, which also granted him superhuman powers. He decided to continue fighting for justice as the superhero Mighty Man. The comic was developed by Richard Manville, a New York-based marketing consultant, and funded by the Republican Americans. Manville was the brain behind Afri-Comics, which also produced other superhero titles like Tiger Ingwe and African's Secret Agent. Manville wanted to produce comics for South Africa aimed at the black population, which would include profiles of relatable African leaders, but the apartheid South African government only saw its potential as propaganda material. Mighty Man never challenged any agencies or laws. One of the artists, Joe Orlando, would reveal that he was restricted from creating stories in which people challenged the government, resisted colonialism or slavery, and he was encouraged to talk about non-controversial topics like football or folk stories. So Mighty Man focused on gangsters called Sotsis and dagger merchants who were drug lords, subservience to the law, non-violence, an anti-gun message for black people were the main themes of the stories. It is not surprising that most black South Africans saw the comic as propaganda by the apartheid government and directed their rage at newsstands that sold the comics during the Soweto crisis, ending the publication of Afri-Comics, and with it, all its titles. Tiger Ingwe was another superhero title from Afri-Comics that was popular during this period. Canon law depicts him as a half-man, half-beast warrior who possessed the strength and abilities of a tiger and battled evildoers on the African continent. The name Ingwe means leopard in Zulu, not tiger. Just like Powerman's publishers, Manville did not think there were native creators that could develop the comic and used various freelancing artists, hence the unfortunate naming mistake, which could have easily been avoided. Not all comic books during this period were in the superhero genre though. In fact, the most popular Nigerian comic book of the 70s and 80s only had super in its name to describe the metaphorical orgies of the bright future a woman carries behind her. The word Ikebe is a Yoruba term that is translated as ass, buttocks, or nyash if you speak the local Nigerian lingua franca, specifically a woman's buttocks. Ordinarily, it is a word that would be scoffed at, but Ikebe Super proved that any eye there, no matter how small or banal, can lead to great wealth. In December 1976, Wale Adenuga published the first Ikebe Super magazines with his savings from his youth service year. The magazine became a hit with comics like Fokada and the World vs. Village Superman, but it was the cast of Ajasco family that would become household names. Every week, readers looked forward to the self-flattering and chronic womanizer Papa Ajasco, his suspicious and skeptical wife Mama Ajasco, their naughty son Ajasco, and the bald-headed naive numbskull Pa Jimo. The playboy Boyalinko and his gold-digging crush Miss Pepeye completed the hilarious cast of slapstick characters. Papa Ajasco comics were occasionally raunchy and had sexual undertones, but never downplayed its humor, which made it a household favorite. The tirades of the long-suffering Mama Jesco after the infidelity of her old rascal of a husband is discovered always shone over the infidelity itself. Readers could leer at Boyalinko's bawdy side, laugh at Ajasco's mischievous ways, and even excuse Miss Pepe's materialism. Ikebe Super went viral before the word viral became a thing, and sold thousands of copies at its peak. Wale Adenuga was sole writer and artist for all the cartoons in the magazine for the first 4 years, until its success forced him to hire artists like Morak Oguntade, Aliu Eroje, and Byron Enuma to take up the drawings. Morak Oguntade would especially be popular and go on to illustrate comic strips like Emulewu and Mama Twins. Pa Adenuga would go on to publish offshoot magazines such as Super Story and Binta, building on the phenomenal success of Ikebe Super. The immense popularity of the magazine led to the release of a celluloid film, Papa Ajasco, in 1983, with Peter Fatomolola playing the lead, Sunday Papi Aluwe, Omobolanle as Pajimo, and the late Jimmy Shodimu as Boy Alinko. It became the first blockbuster movie in Nigeria, grossing, believe it or not, 61,000 naira in 3 days. The decline of the Nigerian economy in the late 1980s brought an end to the magazine. Loss of patronage, coupled with increased cost of production, made Wale Adenuga to diversify from print into electronic media. By 1996, Papa Jasco and Company television series began to air, and the magazine ended for good. Before it ended, however, Ikebe Super delved into the superhero genre and featured Papa Jasco as a powerful medicine man who could fly and shoot fireballs. The writers had him fight apartheid in South Africa. At its peak, Ikebe Super was unbeatable and would delight an entire generation of readers. Pa Adenuga, son of a tobacco merchant, had created Nigeria's best-selling magazine with nothing but paper, ink, and business savviness. Nonetheless, Ikebe Super did not hold a monopoly on the cartoon industry and had direct competitors that also told excellent stories. After a friend of his father told him he could have a career as a cartoonist, Moses Osawe walked into the corporate headquarters of the Daily Times newspaper in Kakawa Street, Lagos, with a bag full of his street cartoons. He had just graduated from CMS Grammar School, Bariga, and had no formal training as an artist. His only motivation were the words of his father's friend, who was a woodcarver. He managed to get through the security protocols and met the editor of the Evening Times. In October 1973, he started freelancing as a cartoonist for the Evening Time and was paid 4 naira every day his cartoon got published. In 1984, Osawe began Fun Times comic magazine with his friend David Lasekan, son of a pioneer Nigerian cartoonist Akinola Lasekan, with titles like Pa Johnson and Gabriel. The first edition of Fun Times was released in October 1984 and sold 50,000 copies in 48 hours. Fun Times would grow to be one of the 3 cartoon giants of the 80s, directly competing with Ikebe Super and Loli magazines. Unfortunately, the sour relationship between the magazine and Daily Times would eventually spell its reign. Moses Osawe had been the envy of the Daily Times staff when he first began cartooning for the Evening Times, a publication under the Daily Times stable. He was getting paid every Saturday rather than wait for a monthly salary like every staff. He would continue there as a freelance cartoonist until he left for Italy to pursue a bachelor's degree in fine arts. He was able to come to an agreement with Daily Times and got them to distribute his new magazine. He and Lasekan also got to work from an air-conditioned office, although they were not Daily Times staff. Unfortunately, by 1987, Osawe began to notice discrepancies in how many magazine copies were being sold and how much royalties he was receiving. He did some investigation and realized Daily Times had been lying about the sales figures. When he tried to convince Lasekan to leave Daily Times with him, he would learn to his dismay that he had overestimated his partner. Lasekan would rebuke him for probing into the matter, and he would eventually leave Fun Times. Fun Times would lose its standing under Lasekan, dropping from 40,000 copies to a mere 15,000. Daily Times gave him a 3-month ultimatum to revive sales, and when it could not be done, they kicked him out, bringing Fun Times to an end. In 2018, 30 years after Per Johnson and Gabriel disappeared from Fun Times, Osawe held an exhibition in Ikoyi, Lagos State. 25 of his artworks, some as drawings, but most of them as oil paintings, were on display on the walls of Mo House Hotel. Osawe's satire and fluid art style are as impressive as ever, but now Per Johnson and his companion are mere relics of a time past, never to test the popularity they enjoyed in the 80s. Perhaps we could say it was more fortunate for him to still be able to get the public eye after so long. The third of the big three of the 80s did not enjoy such longevity. For most kids in the 80s, Lolly was the magazine you never wanted to be caught reading. Just as other men would hide porn magazines in newspapers when they bought them, teenagers would hide Lolly magazines in textbooks to avoid Koboko. Dauda, the sexy guy, the main character of the magazine, was a menace. In today's world, where feminism and leftism are prevalent, it would not see the light of day. And if it did, the internet cancel culture would have its next victim. But in the heyday of Ikebe and Lolly, Dauda was king, also known as Mr. Naxon. A name the newspaper would later be called. Dauda was a randy guy who never figured out how to keep his loins in his trousers. Dauda would sometimes woo his catch, and other times just skip the talking stage and ravish his catch. Other characters in the magazine: John, the sex-smart driver Lewis, his promiscuous wife Comfort, were just as lewd as Naxon. Despite being poor and ugly, Dauda always pulled it off with every single woman, and that perhaps was where his allure lay. He represented the hip culture of the time and the fantasy of the men with raging testosterone who bought this soft porn. Another characteristics of Mr. Naxon was that he never discriminated. Married women, spinsters, mad women, house helps, beggars, hawkers, and even fellow commuters were all on his menu. He seduced them all, albeit with a lot of trouble. Each issue ended with him in trouble, and he often returned the next week with bruises and injuries he had suffered from last week's escapades. The magazine began in 1982, and ironically, in Sokoto, the Islamic Caliphate, where Sharia is prevalent. Its main cartoonist was David Lasekan, who worked with Osawe on Fun Times. The magazine had Bayo Onanuga as its editor. Lolly folded up during the economic downturn of the 80s and was not revived. Today, searching for the magazine on Google pulls up a thread on chat forums like Gistmania and Nairaland, where users reminisce on the hilarious escapades of Naxon and call him a bad guy. There is very little information about arguably the third biggest comic magazine of the 80s, and it seems Dauda, the sexy guy, just disappeared. Perhaps he eventually met his Waterloo at the hands of one of his big-bottomed women, or got the beating of his life at the hands of an angry husband, and finally learned to zip up his trousers. We will never know. But what we do know is that Dauda, the sexy guy, was a bad guy. Captain Africa was the first true Nigerian superhero and was created by Andy Ackman, a Ghanaian. Ackman wished to eliminate colonial biases that comics like Powerman and Mighty Man carried. According to him, if Africa was to have a superhero, then it should be a Superman, not a Tarzan. Captain Africa wore a green suit with a map of Africa on his chest and a solar-powered cape that gave him supersonic flight. He was relatable because he fought contemporary issues in African countries, such as child murders and kidnappings. Captain Africa was part of a superhero boom that began in the 1980s as cocaine trade and military coups strained Nigeria's relationship with the rest of the world. Imports became difficult. Foreign comics disappeared from the shelves overnight, and Nigerian comics appeared in the markets to fill those shelves. But while Captain Africa is probably the last comic magazine to leave a mark in the first generation, there were probably dozens of comic strips in newspapers and magazines, and we will be doing history a gross disservice if we fail to mention them. Akinola Lasekan was Nigeria's first cartoonist and is considered one of the pioneers of modern art in the country. He was a staunch supporter of Nnamdi Azikiwe and used his cartoons in the West African pilot to attack Zike's opponent and make social commentaries. After Lasekan's success in the West African pilot, other newspapers soon got cartoonists of their own, and cartoon strips soon became commonplace in Nigerian magazines. Dele Jegede's Kole the Menace, published in the Daily Times, made him a household name. Adeboye Adegbenro worked for The Punch, Concord, and eventually left for the US in 1990, where he worked as a 2D illustrator for Walt Disney. Josie Ajiboye would become popular for his Josie Ajiboye on Sunday column in the Daily Times. Folashade Adebare was Nigeria's first female cartoonist, and the history of cartoons in Nigeria would not be complete without her. The list goes on. Each cartoonist brought their style, and the most successful ones became minor celebrities in the media world, as well as with the government's secret police. Akinola Lasekan had set a precedent with his cartoons, and newspaper strips were often social commentaries that mocked the military government with biting wit and satire. It often got them unwanted attention, as the government was not tolerant of journalism that questioned them. When imports slowed and foreign comics became difficult to purchase, fake low-quality comics began to appear. This would last until 1982, when better-made comics made them virtually worthless. In 1980, the comic strip Bimbela was published and followed the adventures of Bimbela, who could fight and had superhuman strength. It had good quality art and strong storytelling, and was created by David Lasekan. Another nostalgic strip from this era was Terror Mother. The character was quite similar to Mr. Naxon in deeds, though, rather than appearance. He was a playboy that always got the women in the end. When Vanguard newspaper began publications, its competitors were serious in tone, and their cartoons mostly served for political or social commentaries. Vanguard targeted younger readers and featured light-hearted comic strips. From the hilarious couple Mr. and Mrs. to the space opera Shango to Mora Koguntade's detective fiction Mojo, Vanguard came with more visuals and soon got footing against old market leaders like Times and Standard. Vanguard had some competition from Princessa Comics, which has now disappeared without a trace. Princessa published superheroes that were knockoffs of Marvel and DC characters and followed the UK pattern of colorful covers with black and white interior pages. Their quality was poor and they lacked originality, copying art directly from existing comics. They claimed they had gotten the rights to produce Marvel comics in Nigeria, but folded soon after. By early 1990s, the Nigerian economy was failing, and reading comics became a luxury most Nigerians just could not afford. Just as the political scene transitioned to democracy, Nigerian comics history transitioned into the silent era, and comics would not be revived until the 2000s. The first generation was marked by two types of superheroes: the Afro comic books created by non-Africans who did their best to portray relatable characters despite restrictions they had to work with, and the African comic books that captured the true African settings and dived into real issues that Africans could relate to. Another distinct trend is that the best-selling titles were comedies, not superhero. It reveals a trait common to Nigerians. It is easier for us to laugh at our problems than hope to be saved. It is even more difficult for us to take actions and save ourselves. Wale Adenuga was undisputedly the most influential figure of the first generation, while Andy Ackman takes his flowers as the Stan Lee of his generation. Why have you never heard of the history of Nigerian comics? Because until now, few people thought we had a history, and fewer still thought of telling it. To Nigerians, comics are for children and should be left that way. There is no history because it is seen as a recreational tool, a side quest. But comics are stories, and nothing speaks African than stories. From folklores of the cunning tortoise and Ananse the spider to real profiles of slain African leaders, we are our stories. Why have you never heard the history of Nigerian comics? Why are all these heroes and stories forgotten? Because those that should have known better thought that stories were nothing more than stories. Now, we complain of the loss of reading culture and moral decadence among the youths, forgetting the role the older generation played in enforcing it. A people without stories is a people without culture. They are a lost people, and there are people that benefit from keeping us lost. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel, the only place you'll find videos devoted to spotlighting comics in Nigeria. Take a moment and tap the notification bell to be updated when we drop the next video, and share this video so we can reach other comic lovers like yourself and us. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.